All right, ready for part two? Here we go. Part two. So, part two, now that you've decided on a question, and in that um, pre-writing, you really thought about those reasons, those topic sentences that leads into those quotes and that, citation. What's that main point? Just really those in the body that making sure that your paragraphs have those topic sentences. What's your main point you're making? Why you give that evidence, and then that interpretation, and that's you. And no, don't leave that out, because in this case, you're not summarizing. When you're given an article that everybody in class has read, a story, if the teacher says summarize it, do it. Okay? If they don't say anything, don't do it. I mean, they've read it. Everybody's read it. It's like if you are big, my son and his girlfriend, her family, like they're huge fans of Star Wars. Like they're even like in an official Star Troopers group, whatever. Anyway, I'm a Star Trek person. Anyway, so if I say, remember that part in Star Wars, this and that movie when that happened, and they're gonna go, yeah, and I go, yeah, and that's not a conversation, right? I don't need you to retell me this story. I've read it a bunch, okay? Um, you don't need to retell the story, right? We're focusing on that. So what? So don't summarize. Instead, what are your reasons? What's the evidence? And what do you think? And most of the time, I mean, this kind of writing it is a compliment because it's a teacher saying, look, yeah, you could memorize stuff and take a test. Big deal. That smart fifth grader can do that, right? But what do you think about it? What's your opinion? What do you think? And so you definitely want that interpretation, that connection, and that's where you are in this. You're not saying, here's what I think, but it is, here's what you think. You just drop it that I. And if you're not saying so and so said this, or, Leo writes, or Sai says, you're not doing that attribution, doing that citation. It's clear the rest of it, it's what you think. So really, you've got the guts of your argument in there. That's the body, that's the middle part. And so what we want to do is figure out what happens in those introductions and conclusions. And I highly recommend you start with the conclusion, okay? Just remember it's more than just an ending. To conclude, yes, does mean to wind up and finish, but it also means, what do you conclude? Well, after looking at the evidence, I conclude that I did not steal my own coffee cup, right? What's that big picture that you draw? What is the big takeaway from this? The big so what? And that's where you want to go deeper. And that's why you want to make sure you're not just repeating, here's what happened in the story. Cool. Glad you read it. Glad I read it. Glad we all read it, right? So you got to dig deeper. So what do? You can discuss how all of the points you've given in your essay add up to illustrate something bigger about the issue. So whatever the big issue you're talking about, whether it's connected society, it's relationships, it's whether we actually have any agency in a world that is controlled by so much, kind of big companies and things like that. So those are big issues, right? Or explain how those points lead to a logical view or way to progress on the issue. I mean, does this show kind of ways that we can move against that, or ways that we should think about living our lives a little differently, or living them in a certain way, something like that. So it's going from that, here's the kind of topic that was discussed, here's the evidence, and what your Liu is saying about it in the case of the perfect match, and how we see it working in society. You've given what you thought, you know, and then you can kind of step back, and here's where you can really be that philosophical. So what in the grand scheme of things? Not just that story, not just like examples from our lives, but overall. Big deal, philosophical deal. So here's where you get philosophical. And so here's a couple examples from our sample essays. And remember, you can always go back to them, go to the literary analysis page, and they're all right here, right? There's video walkthroughs, the paragraph date breakdowns, the sample in MLA format, so you can see here's what it looks like. You can look at it and say, okay, mine should look like this with the heading and the works cited, that kind of thing. So remember, they're all there for you. But here's an example. In the end, and this is the Bradbury one, the pedestrian. Bradbury is making a statement about the power of technology and its potential to separate us from each other and be addictive, but he's also making a statement about being alive. And remember when I went through that, when I talked about how, I mean, it was just more than that, right? I mean, he is saying, yeah, and he was in the 50s talking about TV. We could talk about cell phones, we could talk about newspapers, radio. People have been saying this new technology is going to, like, make us all dumb. When print came along, like not just print, but like written language, people were literally saying, "Well, we're going to lose our memory because we're not passing on oral traditions." And yeah, do we lose something from that? Yeah, right. But do we also gain something? Yeah. So, but he's saying something bigger, right? Making a statement about what it means to be alive. And this is me writing this. What I think. You got to think about what you think. For Bradbury, it's more than simply existing. So this first sentence is kind of, in doing this, I'm kind of just summing up. So here I am kind of saying, here's what I said. But you've got to go beyond that in your conclusion. You don't just say, here's what I said. I read it, your teacher read it, you read it. So what? Big deal. For Bradbury, it's more than just existing. It's engagement with our natural world. It's not letting our shells, clothes, houses, cars represent us. Most importantly, it's engaging with the structures we've built that make up society, people's rights, laws, and human interaction. And that was totally me, reading that and saying, here's what I think, because, yeah, he's saying, all these people are stuck behind their TVs and they're not experiencing the natural world and everything. And to me, that led me to the deeper conclusion that Bradbury is saying all of these things, and like that police car, that there were no people, it's just the car, right? That when we don't engage with other people, when we don't engage with nature, um, in that way, that we lose something very dear to being alive. And that's what I think. That's where I went beyond just, look, here's the facts of the story, and said, I think he's really saying something deeply about that. So, in the resistance one, here, remember, it was asked, it's that comparison. So again, I'm going to sum up the comparison that was made. In short, both we and the citizens of the space station want the easy answer. We want to take a pill and be immediately cured. We want to do one exercise and have the perfect body. We want to watch the video and have all the education. Yet we can't. When we stop participating in our lives, not simply on a physical level, but also on an intellectual level, but by making decisions about our government and our society, we lose much of our humanity. In comparing our society to Bucknell's and resistance, there are similarities. And so here I'm just kind of transitioning. In their world, it took the algorithm taking over to make them value what they'd given up and previously shunned. And so here, now I'm moving into the, okay, look, I drawn in the essay all these similarities, and I'm kind of summing that up, and then I'm moving into, okay, so what? Big picture. How far we will go in letting computers, whether intelligent or not, take over our decisions and lives is not clear. However, what is clear is that we are on our way there, much like the residents in the space station, because we're overwhelmed and overburdened. The question is whether we will discover that we do not want that easy route because of the cost to our freedoms, or if we'll adopt it and give up our independence for convenience. And sometimes you don't have the answer, right? I mean, can we answer that question? I know I love a lot of the convenience that things give me. When people say back in the good old days, I'm like, which ones? First of all, electricity, really cool. Running water, oh my gosh. Medical advancement, the fact that I didn't nearly die giving birth to my child. I mean, the reason there are wicked stepmothers in fairy tales is because so many, and I mean so many, look at the numbers, you know, child childbirth mortality. So many women died in giving childbirth that men did have numerous wives because, she gave birth to a baby and she died and have a couple, and sometimes you lived and sometimes you didn't, and it's all about good medical care. Yeah, so those weren't the good old days, right? From where I'm looking. Um, so I like the convenience, but also is there something that we do lose that is worth not things not being as easy for? I don't know. I don't think there's not an answer for that. And so you can't always kind of like duck it by saying, oh, this is just something we'll have to figure out. So really think about it. Are you using that as like the cop out conclusion? Or is that really what, like the guts of the story or the reading or whatever it is you're talking about is getting to? Is it saying this is something as a society we need to deal with? And for me, I think Bucknell is saying that. I think he's saying, look, we've got all this technology. We could do this voting like this. You know, we need to think about whether it's a good idea or not. And maybe in some cases it is, in some cases it isn't. But we need to start having that conversation. And so, from my conclusion is about having that conversation is something that we need to start doing. And so you can see how that's bigger picture than just kind of. I mean, he talks about a lot of intricacies, but this is the kind of deeper thing to point to. So that's what you do with those conclusions, right? It's really you sit back, be a little philosophical. The next part is developing a thesis, and I know that you did a draft of it in your last essay, but when you do this pre-writing, don't look back at that part and just kind of rewrite it again, right? Think about go back to that question and say, how would I answer it now? Because if you come up and don't try to like remember what you wrote in the other one, just say, how would I answer it? Because if you have kind of a couple of different drafts, you can look at them and you may find I like this part here and that part there. You may realize, oh, you know what? Since I've done that, I've been thinking more, and this newer one's a better way of stating what I really think. Remember, this kind of writing is all about not just learning to write well and analyze well, but it's learning as you do the writing, you are learning what you think. So the writing itself is part of the discovery. Um, so once you've gathered your evidence, interpreted it, drawn conclusions, it's a perfect time to write or refine that thesis. And so, how would you answer that question now? Do that. That's part of this pre-writing too. And then, and so here's, we'll look at these introductions in a little bit, but, and we saw this in the conclusion, right? My thesis was for Bradbury Living's more than being isolated, it's interacting with people. And so, the question is, what is Bradbury saying about what it means to actually live? Going back and looking at that question one more time, always throughout any analysis. I don't care if you're writing a one paragraph one, you look at your question, your assignment in the beginning. Once you've done it, of course, in the middle, if you need to go back and stay focused. Um, and then once you've done it too, go back and look at it and say, look, did I answer this question? This is the kind of writing it's easy to get off track with, to turn it into that bigger, different kind of essay, or to kind of think, oh, I know what the question is, and you answer the question you thought was there. I can't tell you how many times I've done that. So going back with analytical writing, with deep involved writing, the deeper it gets, the more you work into your field, the higher level you write at, the more often you need to go back and say, what is my job? Let me make sure I'm staying on track with it. Here with resistance, what connections do you see between the way the leader in the story Pan came about and any of our current desires? And what does that say about humanity, or what problems does that present? And that's where I said overall, like most humans, we're often seeking the easy route. And while in this story that route had some protections, in our story it might not. So that was my kind of just overall conclusion. That becomes my thesis, the answer to my question. And remember the beauty of being presented a question. When you're presented questions, your thesis is always going to be that answer. If you're not given a question, turn your assignment into a question. Ask yourself, what question is this asking? Write it out as a question. Answer that question. You've got a thesis. And then all you've got to do is say, well, what parts did I read? What evidence could I use that made me think that? And that's where, pull those quotes, use those parts of evidence, and explain how those things made you think that answer. So now your introduction needs to do these three things. You've got to get readers into it. Give the author's name and title of the work. So anytime you're writing about any reading, literature, poetry, a movie, an article, whatever it is, make sure you give that author's name and the title of the work, and then end with your thesis. Put your thesis at the end of your introductory, that first paragraph, okay? Put it there, give it to your teachers that way. That's where they're looking for it. Just make their life easier. Remember, I would turn in my papers, and I knew my teacher was grading my other classmates' papers, but I never thought of that. All I thought of was my teacher's grading my grade papers. Um, Grading papers in English class especially is weighty, right? Because like here, I'm teaching you how to write. So like when I'm commenting on your drafts, I'm giving you that feedback that is instructional, not just, this is good, or, oh, don't do that, bad. No, I'm saying, yeah, this is good. Yay, check marks. Yay, this is good. But also, oh, wait, here, don't forget you need to do this, or don't forget to give that author's name, or treat that title correctly, whatever it is. So, um, that takes more time. But even in a class that's not English class, to go through and grade a paper, a lot of your papers, tests online, Blackboard will grade them. Even if a teacher gives you some form to fill out test, or, an essay test, they ask you an essay question, they've got to read that. But they're reading that for concepts, and are you doing that? And pay attention to your grammar, because if they have to struggle to figure out what you're saying, they're not even getting to the ideas that are in their course. And that's why we're studying grammar here, because if that interferes with them getting to what's in your head and what's in your heart, they're never going to get there, right? But that's why we do what we do here in English. But even in other classes, even when you've got it down and you're careful and it's clearly written, it still just takes time to read through everybody's stuff. So if you can make it easier, remember we're you know, thinking about not just what do you have to say, but understanding there's a reader on the other side of that page. And if you can make the reading experience better for them, they're going to be in the happier place. And if they're in the happier place, they're going to see your writing is better. They're going to see you as a better student, a stronger worker, a more valuable employee, whatever it is, more eligible for the scholarship, whatever it is. So you want to keep that in mind. And in terms of this academic structure, this is later on, as you move on, you'll see once you read in your field other ways of doing it, and you can totally do it that way. But for right now, or for any general education class, do it this way, right? When you're struggling with like deep, complex things, and you're like, I don't quite understand this all, don't make it harder by throwing in some funky form or structure. Go to this, do this. That way, the thinking is deep and complex, and the structure, you say, I know this is how it goes. So if you have, there it is right there, a reading that has an author and a title, get those in there. And then, of course, always end with your thesis, that first paragraph. So that's what you want to focus on with the introduction. Now, big topic overall, we can do it a couple of ways. Ray Bradbury's classic story, The Pedestrian, and the boom, is very simple. I start with a simple sentence there. I've got Bradbury, and after that, after first and last, I'm only going to use his last. That's MLA, okay? When we go into APA next essay, it'll be different. The Pedestrian, there's the title, treated correctly, is very simple. Now, all I have to do from now on is just Bradbury. A man goes for a walk and gets taken to jail for suspicious behavior, walking outside. So, boom, but that's all. Notice that kind of summarized the story in one sentence. I'm not retelling the whole story. You can summarize the story in one or two sentences, that's fine. Just don't go into it retelling. While this story questions how technology can overwhelm us and separate us from one another, it also makes a clear statement about what it means to live life. And notice here, I'm hinting at that question. You want to make sure your introduction, if you're given questions and you're supposed to pick one, unless your teacher says so, don't write that in question in your paper. No, no, and there's some style, some finesse, right? But you do want to make sure it's very clear which question you're using. So you're borrowing some of the language from it as you lead up to it and in response to it, okay? And that's what I did there. That question says, what does it mean to live life? So he's making a clear statement about what it means to live life. At this point, you're like, okay, that's the question she's answering. How does he do it? Through his use of description. He creates a picture of hundreds of people we never see. This living death they exist in is devoid of interaction with one another. And that question talks about, he describes their like houses as tombs and that kind of thing. The laws we set up to govern ourselves and the actual nature of the world. It says, what is Bradbury saying about living life? So here's my thesis. My answer to the question is, for Bradbury, living is more than being isolated. It is interacting with our world and the people in it. So you can see how I've taken this kind of, the big topic here is Bradbury's story. And anytime you're writing about a story or an article, that can be your topic, right? That's easy. And then boom, I'm just leading toward that answer to the question. So that's one way to develop an introduction about a reading like this. Another way is just talk about a general kind of, you know, um, topic. In our world, advertisers and marketers use information we provide through social media, our buying habits, and our searches to make decisions about what we might like. It's a growing field in research and marketing and shows little signs of slowing down. In fact, very few laws in this country have been successful at curtailing this movement. But this is something that's also been pushed by each of us as users. We want convenience, we want technology to take over the easy tasks, and we want to worry about the little things less. So in this case, what I'm doing, instead of talking about the story, I haven't mentioned the story yet, I'm just thinking about those big ideas. And you can see how this connects to my conclusion we just looked at too, right? Where I talked about we want the easy feel. When I was writing that, I wrote that conclusion first, and then I looked at this. I worked on this, and I said, oh, let me bring in that easy thing. So, in that conclusion, I was talking about the big idea of, how our world is very similar to this. So instead of starting by saying, in this story, in this reading, which worked well in that paragraph for the Bradbury story, I'm talking about just today, us in our world, what's going on, what's the similarity between the stories. So instead of talking about the story, I'm talking about just kind of us in general. But then I'm going to focus it because notice this next sentence, in reading Tobias S. Buckles, so author, story resistance, it's clear there are a number of connections between his world and ours. And this, again, it's using some of that wording from the sentences, from that question, so it totally points toward this is the question I'm answering. Overall, like most humans, we are all often seeking an easier route. And while in his story, that route had some protections built in it, in our story, it might not. And so, what's the answer to the question? That's my answer at the end, right? Is that we really have to think about that. So, those are two different approaches. One is to go from, the kind of general topic of the story itself or article reading, whatever it is. And the other one is to go from the more theoretical or, the kind of bigger picture topic. So in terms of making choices and computers doing things for us, that being nice. But then make sure either way, where that author's name goes in the title of the work, that can appear anywhere at the beginning, the middle, the end, whatever. But make sure you end it with that thesis sentence. Really important. And so that's really what you're doing is you're doing a kind of you're doing a conclusion, drawing conclusions. And you go back through, look at that pre-writing one, and then sit down and say, so what? That's your conclusion. Draw your conclusion. So what? What's the big deal about all that stuff I pointed out there? And then just do a quick kind of rewrite of your thesis to see if you come up with any other ideas or just ways of phrasing it. It may be really similar. You may be like, yeah, or you may be like, wow, that does sound better. Or I like this. Or you can use kind of one introduction, one conclusion, maybe. And then you're going to think about that introduction and those parts that go into it. As you read through your first pre-writing, if you come to stuff, you're going to have it saved in, your draft on your computer. Reread through it, but as you come to stuff that you want to refine and reword, boom, do that there, because the better, again, you get these. Once you get these, you can see this gives you a draft, right? So that's what you're going to do, because the next step is to go get the form for this, which is linked in your syllabus. And of course, in the pre-writing under our literary analysis unit, remember, whoops, wrong one, right there, right, there's pre-writing too. And on the schedule, of course, and on the web page, the literary analysis web page, of course, under the pre-writings and the forms. But go to the pre-writing too, and you can open the form and fill it out. And then as you do that, though, at the end of this one, there's a nice list that says, look, here, once you have done this second pre-writing, yeah, make sure that you go and you turn it in, right? Click on submit and turn this in, just attach it. So this one you're attaching. But once you do that, read through this because this gives you some reminders to think about as you're putting this essay together. And if you focus on this, on doing each of these pre-writings, like read each of these steps really carefully in those forms. When I say do that, write out a full sentence, write out the full sentences, put those whole quotes in there, do that stuff. The better you fill these out, the more you have a basic draft. And then it's just going to be following the instructions at the end of pre-writing 2, putting it together, smoothing it out. Go to the writing center, that's a good thing. Get some feedback on it, and then getting that draft to me so that I can also give you that feedback on it before you turn in the final. And really, it's a step by step. Is it going to lead to, do these pre-writings lead to like the perfect essay? No, I've never written the perfect essay. It doesn't exist. It's not about perfection. It's about progress. Remember that. It's not perfection, it's progress. Get a little bit better every day. You do that, life is good. Life is good. So work on it. Let me know if you have questions. Take care of yourself. And that's all I got for today. So cool beans.